Do you see psychiatry as fundamentally a study of the human mind and not just a set of tools for treating psychological maladies?
Absolutely. I think psychiatry is our best way to understand who we are as people. I mean, it looks at our biology. How does our brain work? How does it connect the parts with one another? How does the chemistry in it work? It's the very foundational aspects of who we are, and then it manifests as psychology. What do we think? What do we feel? What are our strivings? What are our fears? So, yeah, I think psychiatry provides tools that we can use to help each other, but those tools come through it being a discipline of understanding.
So, with every patient you see, with every mind you explore, are you picking up a deeper understanding of the human mind?
I think I'm trying to. I think we should be able to take something away from everything we do, every interaction to some small degree.
Every conversation, it doesn't have to be a patient, just anywhere. At Starbucks, getting a coffee, you can learn something from that little experience.
Yeah, even if you just reinforce sort of gentle kindness and gratitude and decent human interaction, there's a reinforcement of that even if we don't take away memories or lessons, so to speak, we can reinforce who we choose to be.
So understanding ourselves from those interactions too, not just the general sort of philosophical human mind, but understanding our own mind, introspect on how our own mind works.
Yeah, because everything we understand about anyone or anything else is coming through here, right? So, if we're understanding others, we're also understanding ourselves. It's all feeding through us. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a tricky thing to step away and look at your own mind and understand that it's just a machine. And you can kind of control the way the machine processes the external environment and the way that machine converts the things it perceives into actual emotions, like how it interprets the things it perceives. You can just sort of step away and analyze it in that way, and then you can control it. You can oil the machine. You can control how it actually interprets the perceptions in order to generate positive emotions, and be like a like a mechanic for the gears in the machine.
I think to some degree, but the difference, I think, at least as I understand, I think of machines as not being inscrutable, right? That if there's enough study, there's enough acumen applied, that we can understand whatever it is we're trying to figure out. Whereas part of understanding ourselves is understanding that there are things we can't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's indispensably important, I think, to health and happiness, and also to having enough humility to see how people can be different from us, how we can be different from ourselves at times. So knowing that we don't know a lot and having some idea of what that might be, I think is an indispensable part of the process, which I think is different from machines, I think.
Yeah, the machines, you're basically saying machines generally, because they're engineered from a design, they're usually going to be simpler, therefore understandable. Mm-hmm. And you're saying the complexity of the human mind is, at least from our perspective, nearly infinite.
Because there are meta phenomena, what sometimes gets described as sort of levels of emergence, where at increasing levels of complexity, you have novelty evolve that you can't predict from lower levels of complexity. Like, for example, atoms to molecules. It's just one example. I think neurons to consciousness to culture, right? That there are meta phenomena that separate from the phenomena underneath of them, and thereby add in an entire aspect of novelty. So I think we are, I really think this is true, that we are all infinitely fascinating because of these levels of emergence, of novelty that are inscrutable because you can't predict from one level to the next or understand fully, are what make us, and not just us, but I think sentient creatures, right? Human beings, right? But sentient creatures inestimably more interesting than creatures that aren't sentient. And I don't know, I think when we think about machine learning and artificial intelligence, I think it's that we're trying to create levels of emergence that now we don't fully understand anymore, which I guess is both exciting and maybe scary too.
Yeah, so you start at the physics of atoms, quantum mechanics, go into chemistry, go into biology. From the biology, you have the functional phenomena, especially as manifested in the human brain, and then multiple brains connecting together through consciousness and intelligence creates civilizations. It's pretty interesting. Where do you think the magic is? At which layer of the cake?
Every layer. Because every time you emerge from one thing to another, I see it as an analog, like the concept of the dialectic, right? Where I think it was Hegel, right, who realized, hey, when you have like thing A and thing B, and they're complicated and they come together, you don't get a hybrid of A and B, right? You end up getting something that's new, that's novel, and I think that describes to some degree that like what emergence is, except there's a whole new, in a sense, universe of novelty, right? That comes at each layer of emergence that allows infinite possibilities that weren't possible before. And I think that's why we're so complicated, that our functional neuroscience, right, which I think is psychology, right? Our ability to think about ourselves, about others, to be reflective, is sitting on top of so many layers of emergence. Like the idea of standing on the shoulders of giants, that we're, each of us, our consciousness is standing on the shoulder of a giant of many, many, many levels of emergence, of novelty, so many of which we don't understand. I mean, about subatomic particles, everything that quantum physics means. When does time become important, right? As opposed to things happening outside of time and outside of space. When do we slot into one temporal perspective? And then the complexity just, I think, grows and grows and grows.
Yeah, the interesting word you use is novelty. If true, this really blows my mind. In some either shallow or deep sense, it is true. I'm trying to figure that out. I don't know if you know something about cellular automata. Is this very simple mathematical objects where you have rules that govern each individual little cell, and they interact locally, and that you understand the very simple operation of those individual cells, but at another layer of abstraction, when you just kind of zoom out with blurry vision, these meta objects starts appearing that function. You could build a Turing machine with it. You can build an arbitrary complexity of computation on top of this kind of very simple object.
Yes,
And it's an interesting question whether that was always there. The atoms somehow know about love, right? Like about consciousness,
right.
about war and violence and evil and hate and all that. That's already laid in the possibility of that, the capacity for that. It's already in the atoms.
Right.
It's already in the physics. It's already in the in all the different chemistry that builds up. And it's like even the origin of life, still a mystery. That's known. That's in the physics.
Right.
That's known to the universe, the basic background physics of the universe. If that's not the case, it's like, where does that come from? Where's that magic? And how many layers can the cake possibly have? How many are we going to keep building? If we're constantly through this process of abstraction, of adding a layer to the cake, adding novel things, like where's the ceiling? As we expand out into the cosmos, if we successfully can do that, are we going to keep building like more miraculous, complex objects? And then the brain is just like a middle layer thing. We tend to think of ourselves as truly, truly special manifestations of what's possible in the universe. But maybe we're just like the basic, like tiny building block of something much, much, much bigger. We're in the early days of being a brick in a very large building.
Sure. Look, I think that's entirely possible. I mean, I think the only emergent thing, so to speak, that we build is culture, right? The aggregation of us. So you have individual human minds, which are entirely unique. I mean, even the fact that time is different for you and me, right? It may be by picoseconds, right? But we can engage because our perceptions of time are parallel enough, they're close enough, right? That we can share a reality, right? But we're all living in a different dimension of time, right? I mean, we know that, right? So we're unique in that way. And then the unique individuals that we are, just like the cells, right, start to create not just one thing, not just a culture, but culture on top of our individuality, right? Our uniqueness, our even dimensional uniqueness of time and experience and consciousness. So we create cultures on top of us, but what could be beyond culture, right? And what is different from us, either on underlying levels, like quantum physics or chemistry or biology, or entirely different and unconceived, I think it's an immense question. And I think it's one that should create humility in us, right? That look how much we don't know, and then how reckless we are with ourselves, with our resources, with human life. And I think there it's important to say, I mean, think about how entropy rules the universe around us. I mean, how over selected are we? How many, not just hundreds or thousands of times, but how many millions of times does there have to be a selection branch point before we get into a sort of eddy pool of counter entropy, right? Where you can begin to create, right? Which I think is why you say, okay, the atoms know about love, right? The fact that anything is being created, right, means there's this over selection for counter entropy where there can be a building of greater complexity, of ultimately of novelty. And we don't often think about that, of how far removed we are, maybe light years, so to speak, from any other location, temporally, physically in the universe where this could happen. And we don't think about, what does that mean?
Everything like you said, love, everything is counter entropy. Goes against the way the basic physics of the universe. So maybe actually the atoms really don't like what we're doing. They want us to stop. They've been trying really hard to stop, and despite that, we somehow started this whole bacteria thing for like 1 billion years, and now we're here.
I actually think of it kind of the other way. I don't think there's any purpose to purposelessness, right? So why would anything be
Yeah.
here if the drive weren't towards creativity, right? If the drive weren't towards those subatomic particles not being nothingness that blips in and out of existence, right? Like we think is going on in empty space, for light years upon light years, right? But is there a design, either natural or intentional, for a schema, right? A scenario that allows for the incredibly rare but not non-existent eddy pool of counter entropy where good can happen, right? Where creativity can happen, where ultimately something can grow, something novel can happen. There's no novelty in the vastness of space, even though there's not nothing there. There's novelty here because I think the layers of emergence start stacking very, very, very high when we're in a place of counter entropy, which then could provide even thoughts about like good and evil, right? The idea that creating, that preserving is good, right? It's what we build upon. It's how we get to the eddy pool of counter entropy, right? So then destruction is not good. What good comes of aggression and destruction, right? Unless we're protecting, or even you can think of outlying cases, but just think in general concepts, right? Like destruction destroys. It brings us towards a state of entropy, towards a state of nothingness, whereas goodness, commonality, collaboration, right? Nurturing, right? Brings novelty. It brings new existence into the universe. And I think we don't think about that. We're in the middle of something so vast and built on top of so many layers. And I think it leads us to be cavalier, with human life, including often our own.
So you think there's an underlying creative force to the universe that that might even have a kind of built-in morality to it, where creating is better than destroying, and then that somehow maps onto our society, where we kind of try to figure out what that actually means in terms of good and evil. So that's something is there like that, but it's like, but it has to be. It's like so nice. It's so perfect because it's rare. It's sufficiently rare where we have our own space. Like you can like close the door and like I need to be alone right now as our human civilization to work on my thing. So it's sufficiently rare that there's not other alien civilizations. They're just like constantly knocking on our door, destroying us. But it still exists. That's weird.
Right. It's so
really
fantastically improbable
Yeah.
that I think we should be very respectful of it. And I think you said there's a creative force that values creativity, right?
Yes.
The answer would be, well, sure, if it's a creative force, right, its existence, its ability to exist and to create comes from something other than entropy, right? Something other than so much dispersion that there's nothingness, right? So the creative force will value the sanctity of things, right? Keeping things together, not destroying things, right? Building novelty, including novelty of knowledge, novelty of sentience. I mean, it fits with the idea that we're not nothing, that that's incredibly improbable, and that there are these many, many layers of emergence that we're standing upon. And I think it tells us something that we're not doing ourselves a service to ignore, right? It's not just a jump to saying, oh, there's a religious answer to everything. It's just, no, it's saying science isn't a god either, right? So if we think of science as a tool and not as an endpoint in and of itself, what is the science telling us? Like, I remember showing up at medical school, and it really is true. I mean, I knew so little about the human body. I'd only been in hospitals to visit people. I'd taken pre-med classes, but sort of intensely at once after I didn't take any, and I was working in business. I knew next to nothing. And I had this idea that was so naive in retrospect that I was going to learn so much, right? I was going to answer these questions because I was going to learn what's going on in the body. What are these organs doing? What are these cells? And what I learned was there was so much more that was amazing and mysterious and seemingly impossible. Like even how a cell functions, right? Like what is going on inside of a cell, the transport mechanisms and energy functions and diffusion functions. And then you can go down to smaller levels than that. But when you come back out and you say, how all those cells make a kidney? It's not explanatory. I remember asking the OB who had delivered my first child, right? I was so amazed. And I asked him, like, what do you think? Like, what do you know? You do this, right? You're seeing this life created. And his thought was nothing. I just marvel. I mean, I get to do this, but I just marvel at it. And I think the more we know about us, the more we respectfully marvel.
And we should do that. We should proactively marvel at every aspect, at every layer where the novelty emerges.
Yes. We'd be a lot less likely to say, hey, I don't like you because of something, whatever it is, race, religion, culture, sexuality, gender identity, whatever it is, or I want rights that you don't have, right? Or I want what you have, right? I mean, there's so much of this. And I understand that it's driven by scarcity and by human insecurity and envy and all of these things that I think drive us towards destruction. But all of that recklessness comes from not having this initial appreciation and respect that you're referring to and just marveling at, like, wow, okay, we're here. That's amazing. Let's start with that.